Thank you so much for joining us, and welcome to today's session, Trends in Volunteering, Insights from 2023. My name is Zach Reimers. I work at Volunteering Australia on the National Strategy for Volunteering. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands on which we meet today. We're coming together today to share knowledge about volunteering, but both sharing knowledge and volunteering have taken place on these lands for tens of thousands of years. So today is the newest link in a long chain. I'm joining you personally from the land of the Yugger and Turrbal peoples in Brisbane, Meanjin, and I pay my respects to their elders past and present. If you'd like to acknowledge the country that you're joining from today, you're welcome to do so in the chat. While people are thinking about that, I'd like to introduce our speaker, Nick Biddle. So Professor Nicholas Biddle will be a welcome, friendly face who many of you have seen before in similar sessions to today. He's the Associate Professor of the ANU Centre for Social Research and Methods, Head of the Methods and Survey Program in the Centre, and Lead Researcher for the Policy Experiments Lab. So Nick has a Bachelor of Economics from the University of Sydney, a Master of Education from Monash, and a PhD in Public Policy from ANU, where he wrote his thesis on the benefits of and participation in education of Indigenous Australians. Nick has previously held a Senior Research Officer and Assistant Director position in the Methodology Division of ABS, the Australian Bureau of Statistics, and currently a Fellow of the Tax and Transfer Policy Institute. Importantly for us, and importantly for what we're discussing today, Nick has reported on trends in volunteering over time, and especially tracking participation in volunteering during the onset of COVID-19. So the work of Professor Biddle and his team led to key insights during the development of the National Strategy for Volunteering and other pieces of work. In particular, I'd like to draw your attention to the very informative Volunteering in Australia research piece called The Volunteer Perspective. We'll put a link to that in the chat. Please keep in mind that there'll be an opportunity for questions later in today's presentation. Hopefully you can see the Q&A button on your screen, but if you can't see that, you're welcome to put a question in the chat. Please take a note of any question you have and submit them to us when the Q&A begins a little bit later on. So without any further ado, I'd like to hand over to Nick Biddle to share with us the latest trends in volunteering, insights from 2023. Over to you, Nick.
Thanks, Zach. And look, thanks everyone for coming along to the presentation today. So I'm joining from wonderful Ngunnawal and Ngambri country here in Canberra, and I wanted to pay my respects to Indigenous elders, past, present, and emerging of country which I'm meeting on, as well as recognise that we're meeting from maybe across the world, but particularly across many First Nations. I'd also like to acknowledge any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are joining on this webinar, and thank the First Nations populations for their ongoing kind of custodianship of this and many lands across the country. So as mentioned, I'm going to be giving a bit of an update on some of our data, which we've been tracking over a number of years now. It feels like either just yesterday or 15 years ago when the pandemic started, depending on how you feel at a particular point in time. But we've been tracking volunteering from we looked at volunteering prior to the pandemic, but in particular focus since August 2020. And we really appreciate the collaboration with Volunteering Australia and the opportunity to really get into what is clearly an important topic, and one which I think our policymakers really should be grappling with and are grappling with in terms of how to support volunteers, but also how to deal with shocks like the pandemic or financial shocks, which we've experienced over the last couple of years. So I should acknowledge that the paper is a collaboration with Professor Matthew Gray, Director of the ANU Centre for Social Research and Methods, but also that we've been working on this with a number of collaborators from the ANU as well as the Social Research Centre. So the data which we are going to talk about today and which forms part of our ongoing series is collected by the Social Research Centre as part of the ANU poll series of surveys. So in particular, Dale Vandergilt and Anna Lethborg from the Social Research Centre work very closely with them, trying to kind of collect what is a somewhat tricky question to ask about people's volunteering, given the nature of the activity and how you define hours and engagement in volunteering. And we're really lucky to be able to make use of the Life in Australia panel, which is Australia's only probability-based panel, which allows us to, and what we mean by that is it's not just people opting in to complete surveys. The Social Research Centre recruits people over the telephone as well as through a kind of address-based data collection, people from a diverse range of backgrounds in order to capture people who do volunteer, don't volunteer, have volunteered, have never volunteered, might volunteer in the future, might not volunteer in the future. We have data across all states and territories and across a range of age and other characteristics. So it's a unique data set. The other thing which makes our data set unique is that it's tracking individuals through time. So not only do we have repeated data collection, so data collection in 2020, 2021, 2022, 2023, but we also have information on the same people over that time period. Now, some people drop in, some people drop out of our survey, so it's not always exactly the same people, but for the most part, if you've done one of our surveys, you're likely to do the next one, which means we can not only see what's happening in terms of trends, but also what's happening at the individual level. And we've made use of that data over a number of ways to answer some pretty interesting questions. That data allows, there's questions we can answer which others are not able to. So one of the things which we've been able to do, not for this paper, which we can talk about today, but in previous papers, is look at people's life satisfaction, both prior to commencing volunteering or prior to stopping volunteering. So we can get a sense of how people's well-being is not only related at a particular point in time, but how well-being dynamics relate to volunteering dynamics. And you won't be surprised to know that people who stop volunteering, not only does that predict their well-being at a particular point in time, so those who aren't volunteering have lower levels of life satisfaction, but also are able to show that it's likely that it's the stopping of the volunteering which is predicting someone's life satisfaction rather than the other way around. So we've got a very rich data set. And in this paper, which will be available from the ANU Centre for Social Research and Methods as we're speaking, and we're able to look at, or we focus in this paper on the most recent year of data, which is essentially people who volunteered in the 12 months leading up to April 2023. And we make this data available through the Australian Data Archive. So you can, if you're interested in the data, can analyze the data yourself and answer your own questions. And there's links to that in the paper. So I've got a very rich data set, a few publications, as Zach has mentioned, and hopefully more publications to come as we keep following these people through time. So what have we seen over the last few years in terms of trends in volunteering? So this data is for males and females, and I'll show some age data in a little bit. For both males and females, there was a very large decline in volunteering in the 12 months leading up to the April 2021 survey, or a little over 12 months. Essentially, we had volunteering rates just prior to COVID and then asked again in April 2021. And our April 2020 survey looked at the kind of midpoint of those dynamics. So very large declines and for both males and females over that period. By April 2022, volunteering rates had started to pick up, but had not reached pre-COVID levels. And in our last year of data, we have, and those two trends were similar for males and females. In our last year of data, though, we have some slight differences for males and females. In particular, the volunteering rate for males is now closer to what it was in pre-COVID than the volunteering rate for females. Or to put this another way, even though females started off with slightly higher levels of volunteering in pre-COVID, there's been some convergence with the recovery a little bit lower for females compared to males. But still, both genders less likely to volunteer now than they were pre-COVID. Now, this is a bit of a small graph, so hopefully you can see it on the screen, but it will be made available, or is available as part of the paper, which goes alongside this presentation. You can see in our latest round of data, we have slightly more younger Australians volunteering than those of the next age group, but then a reasonably consistent increase in the rates of volunteering across the age distribution till about the age of 65 to 74, and then a small tailoring off for those 75 years and over. But the key point from our last wave of data is that the increase in volunteering was observed more or less across the age distribution, apart from those aged 25 to 34. So those aged 25 to 34 had no recovery in volunteering essentially since the early days of COVID, whereas for most of the other age groups, there's been some return to pre-volunteering levels. Even if that return is not complete, at the very least, the trends are towards higher rates of volunteering. So that's a positive story, I think, mostly positive story over the last 3 or 4 years. Big declines in volunteering in response to the pandemic, but some returns into 2023 as the pandemic has, the impacts of the pandemic have started to fade and recede. But still lower rates of volunteering now than pre-pandemic for most age groups, with some exceptions. I think a less positive story, or one which we really need to kind of monitor and track, is that when we look at those who were volunteering in both periods, there's been a reduction in the number of hours spent volunteering for volunteers. So there's been an increase in volunteering, but a lower intensity in the 12 months leading up to April 2023 compared to the 12 months leading up to April 2022. And what that means is that when you combine those two bits of data, so the number of people volunteering and the average hours for those who do volunteer, the total hours or the average hours spent over the whole adult population has barely changed in the last 12 months or the 12 months leading up to our most recent survey. So some increase in rates, but a decline in intensity. And while the increase in rates is obviously a positive, if we're thinking about the supports and the services and the benefits to the community of volunteering, it's that kind of good news story is maybe tempered a little bit by that drop in intensity. Now, if you think about the positive impact of volunteering for volunteers, I think it's a slightly more positive story compared to the previous trends, in that our data shows, when we looked at this a little while back, that most of the benefits from volunteering come from whether you do it or not the number of hours. So more people likely to higher levels of well-being, but not necessarily the increase in supports across the community. And so just to respond quickly to one of the chats, yes, this is the number of hours over the 12 months leading up to the survey. So we also have a richer range of data to really understand the characteristics of those who are volunteering, and a little bit of data to see how those characteristics have changed through time. And the biggest or the strongest predictor of volunteering, and this is true for any of the data sets, or any of the waves of data where we've looked at this, the strongest predictor is the education levels of the individual. So we look at this through a regression style approach. I'm not going to go into all the details, but it does allow us to see kind of more direct effects rather than things which might be related to other characteristics. So just keep in mind that when I talk about some of these patterns, I am taking into account the fact that education is related to age or education is related to location. So these are closer to a direct impact. So those with low levels of education less likely to volunteer, and then as you go across the education distribution, the rates kind of continue to increase. Location also matters, both in terms of the socioeconomic characteristics of the area in which a person lives, and also whether they live outside of a capital city or not. And essentially, those who live in relatively disadvantaged areas, even controlling for their own characteristics, are less likely to volunteer than those who live in relatively advantaged ones. And if we think about the demands and the requirement for the services which volunteers provide, then there's kind of a double negative here, in that fewer people get the benefit of volunteering if they're living in disadvantaged areas, but also fewer people getting the benefits from volunteers if they're living in relatively disadvantaged areas. We also have some quite interesting patterns in terms of, I guess, more attitudinal and other less kind of fixed characteristics of individuals. And one of the main ones which kind of comes out in our data is that positive mental health is strongly correlated with higher rates of volunteering. Those who've identified in using the K6 measure of psychological distress as having a potentially severe psychological distress have much lower levels of volunteering than those who have more moderate levels of psychological distress, or those with low or no don't respond to and don't give a don't indicate any of the negative mental health measures on the survey. So of course, as I said, volunteering can support people's life satisfaction and well-being, but this data shows that those who might be struggling with the mental health prior to or in the absence of volunteering are less likely to volunteer themselves. And just a final note in terms of understanding patterns, when we look at our trend data, we do see that those who said that they were less likely to volunteer in the future, that played out in terms of the data. So we asked people in April 2022 how likely you were to start volunteering, and people who said they were more likely to ended up doing so. But it wasn't a complete predictor. So there were a number of people who said they were likely to start volunteering and haven't done so. And I think understanding that gap between intention and actions is an important kind of question to keep looking at. And also those who had fewer hours volunteering in April 2022 were more likely to stop volunteering over the period. So those are, I guess, more tangentially or less intensively volunteering, more likely to stop doing so. So we get a sense of some of those dynamics by looking at the linked data through time. So that's it for our findings, and as I said, there's more in the report, which is available through the ANU website, and I'm sure you'll be directed to links to where to find that, and also in our previous reports. I mean, ultimately, I guess our main conclusion is that what happens in the kind of national picture in terms of shocks and kind of changes to the social and economic landscape do impact on people's volunteering. We can also see some groups which consistently have low rates of volunteering regardless of the external environment. And I think our data and other data can help support ways to target those with low predicted levels, and also find ways to support those who have been volunteering to stay in their in their role if that's what they see as being benefit to them and to the community. And now I'll hand it back to Zach to move us into the Q&A section.
Thank you so much, Nick. That was really, really fascinating, and the chat is alive with lots of questions coming in. We are going to move towards a Q&A. So if you have any questions, please either use the Q&A feature, which is in Teams, or feel free to put them in the chat. I see some people have already. But while people are thinking of questions they may have for Nick, we have a question for you. And so we're going to put something in that should pop up and allow you to type in a response, and we'll be able to see the answers in a word cloud here. And this question is, how might you use the trends identified today in your volunteering practice? Now, this is something Nick touched on just at the end of the presentation there, different ways to think about these trends and how you can use them. And volunteering practice could be very broad in this case. It could mean recruitment of volunteers, management of volunteers, identifying trends. It could mean volunteering yourself, measuring community impact, all this sort of thing. So we have a lot of responses coming in. People are talking about targeted volunteer recruitment. So we're thinking of different demographics that have been perhaps more likely or less likely to return to volunteering, those that may have an intention to volunteer. We have recruitment campaigns, targeted marketing, volunteering strategy, recruitment and engagement, a lot to do with recruitment, which makes sense in the context of what we're talking about today, because we're talking about people returning to volunteering or in some cases not returning to volunteering. So it's really good to know all the different ways that people might be using data today, because it's certainly the practice of Volunteering Australia to have an approach that's informed by data. And we're glad that there's been so much interest in today's session as well. We have over 300 people tuned in right now. It's no surprise that the most common word in the word cloud is the word volunteer. I don't think anyone would be too surprised by that one. But yeah, we can see some common themes here. Promotion of volunteering, that's an interesting one as well. Empathy to volunteers, perhaps understanding the situations that different people are in their life, in other contexts outside of volunteering, and how this interacts with volunteering. These are some of the things Nick mentioned before, referring to education, someone's socioeconomic position, as well as geographically where they might live. Excellent. We'll be able to see the responses that you typed in individually as well. So we'll have a look through that after the event to look for any trends that have stood out at our end. So we'll have a look for some questions here. We have a lot that have come in. I'm going to go to the Q&A feature first. So Nick, we have a question from Simone, which is asking about formal and informal volunteering. And so for anyone who doesn't know, we can think of volunteering as being on a sort of like a spectrum, very institutional, organization-driven volunteering at one side, and less organization-driven, more peer-to-peer, less formal volunteering at the other end. And sometimes we use those categories when we're discussing volunteering. Is this something that is examined in the survey or the report?
Yeah, so we didn't ask about informal volunteering in this wave of data collection, but we did a detailed analysis with the April 2022 data. And I think there's a few key findings there. One is that both formal and informal volunteering are related to each other. So people who do one are more likely to do the other. But there are some groups where there's a bit of a divergence. And the one which was most relevant to me and probably relevant for this discussion is that those who either spoke a language other than English at home or who were born overseas in a non-English speaking country, either slightly less likely to or sometimes a little bit more, quite large differences. So less likely to volunteer with the formal volunteering. But then when we looked at informal volunteering, those differences kind of disappeared. And if you kind of look at the data in depth, you can see sometimes a higher rate for some groups from a non-English speaking background. And what that says to me is that there's obviously a different demand for formal compared to informal volunteering for people who themselves might not have strong English language ability, but also there might be some barriers to engaging with formal organizations for those who don't necessarily have the English language skills to work through some of the, I wouldn't say barriers, but some of the hurdles which might get in the way of more of a formal volunteering. So I think it's good to look at both somewhat different trends, but also some relationship as well.
It's an important thing you touch on there, the different cultural understandings of volunteering as well. And one might fit the mold more neatly of being labeled as volunteering in certain contexts. We had some questions when you were talking about the different demographics of education level. And so, for example, Tegan asks if education has an impact on time being available to volunteer, and Ken followed up with that, asking if education and socioeconomic status could be linked in that way as well. But first I want to ask you, Nick, you mentioned the regression modeling.
Yep.
Are these connections something that has already somewhat been taken into account in the percentages you displayed?
Yeah, so it's quite clear that those with low levels of education tend to be more likely to live in households with low income, have different levels of engagement with formal labour market, and are also more likely to live in relatively disadvantaged areas. And all of those things can explain differences by education. But even when we hold those things constant, so when we look at someone with the same level of household income, with the same employment status, living in the same area, those with low education are still less likely to have engaged in volunteering. And also we I didn't mention it, and sometimes it's more interesting when there's no difference than when there is a difference. We didn't find any differences by hours in terms of number of hours volunteered by education for those who did volunteer. So essentially, education predicts whether you do or you don't volunteer, but it doesn't really predict your level of intensity.
We also had some questions about different behaviors or different types of volunteering. You talked about the average hours given through volunteering. And so Olivia asks about short-term volunteering, if there was anything that stood out to you as people return from COVID isolation or lockdown, if short-term stints of volunteering have factored into that at all.
Yeah, so there's a couple of things. One is that there's, and this probably won't surprise people terribly much, but there's a few people who do a lot of the hours of volunteering, and then lots of people who do only a small amount. Or to put that another way, kind of in kind of thinking about it in a statistics sense, it's a very skewed distribution. And what I kind of expected when I kind of started looking into the data about kind of that spread across the number of hours is that the decline in hours would have been amongst those who were doing lots of hours. So that was my hypothesis, that you have during COVID a big demand. Lots of people have kind of found it hard to volunteer, but you've got a few people who just who are working many hours for volunteering organisation. And I was wrong. It's nice to be wrong sometimes. What was interesting is that it hasn't. We still do have those similar number of people doing large number of hours. It's really just kind of everyone's cut back on their volunteering amongst volunteers in the last 12 months. So those who are doing a small amount were doing a little bit less. Those who are doing medium amounts, a little bit less than that. And those who are doing large amounts had cut back a little bit. It wasn't that kind of all those kind of people who were spending many hours cut back, and that was a bit as a counter to what I was expecting. And it's interesting to really kind of look at those different kind of intensities and where things are changing and what might be driving that. So I noticed there was a question about kind of financial stress and volunteering or the I guess the current economic circumstances. And we do see that to a certain extent, that people who have relatively high incomes or live in households with relatively high incomes are more able to volunteer than those who live in relatively low income households. That can be maybe driving some of the trends. But we found less of a relationship with a kind of financial stress directly than I thought I would. And that has two implications. One is that maybe it takes a little while for these factors to play out, but also that it does mean then that, and I know there's many volunteering organisations represented here, that many of your kind of volunteers will be they are still volunteering. They kind of maintain that commitment, even though a kind of pressure to maybe boost income a little bit, or to cut down on other activities. So that's kind of both a bit of a positive story that people are still kind of maintaining that commitment, but also it means that organisations need to reflect that those who are still there are likely to be suffering a little bit during what is trying economic circumstances.
It is a good thing to keep in mind. We have a question from Shivani asking, could we please expand a bit more on the trends of capital cities and regional volunteering? So is that something we're able to elaborate on a bit more?
Yeah, a little bit. So we certainly do find consistently kind of large differences, both pre-COVID, during COVID, and post-COVID, in terms of volunteering rates being higher outside of capital cities. We do, not in this wave of data, but in previous waves of data, we get some indication that the types of volunteering is different in different locations, and there's some obvious ones. Like a rural fire service is kind of an obvious one, which obviously there are city areas where support for in the rural fire service is important, or kind of natural disasters more broadly. So we do find some differences in both types of volunteering, but a consistent difference. And once again, these differences are even when we kind of control for other characteristics. And there's obviously a few explanations for that difference. One might be kind of travel time. Another is kind of some measures of social cohesion, and we do know that kind of social cohesion, and it tends to be a little bit higher in rural areas. Not exclusively, obviously. These are averages, and also just having having I guess tighter networks in less urban settings. So yeah, some trends, some differences, but it's in many ways a consistent finding, regardless of the kind of the circumstances.
We've still got questions pouring in, Nick. This is really engaging discussion happening in the Q&A and also in the chat. There was a question from Jane. Just as you were mentioning there, you were looking at different types of volunteering. You mentioned the rural fireys. We do have a question from Jane asking about anything else from different sort of industries, we could say, within volunteering that stood out. And specifically, Jane asks about something that I know you've examined in the past, which is people who have had to cease their volunteering due to COVID-19. Yep. So, for example, they were in a sector where that sector was kind of closed off or quarantined. Yep. Jane asks if volunteers that were in one of those areas, if you have any visibility to those volunteers transferring to another type of volunteering.
Yeah, so we've got some information, but yeah, it's a really good question, one we haven't looked into as much detail as we would like. What I would say, though, is that there's in April 2022, we asked of those who were volunteering what the types of industry, the type of work, the type of people who they were providing support for, or the targets of that volunteering. But also what I think is new and novel is we asked of those who weren't volunteering, if you were to start, what are some of the areas or industries or types of volunteering which you'd like to do? And there was a real disconnect. So essentially, there was a lot of people who, this probably won't surprise many people here, who kind of wanted to work with animals in terms of volunteering. A high number of people who wanted to do more conservation type activities, whereas it would appear both the existing volunteers as well as the demand for volunteers is in somewhat different activities. And what we can see, we haven't looked in detail at this data yet, just starting to get a sense of the trends, is that those who had preferences which were more of a mismatch with current volunteering patterns were less likely to have started. So it's like there's a and this is probably not terribly surprising, but it's important to kind of show this with the data, that if you wanted to volunteer in areas which don't appear to either have many people currently volunteering or much demand, then you are less likely to start to do so. So partly, I think that's about identifying for people to know where the demand actually is and what skills and kind of services are required, but also I think it's maybe about finding ways to accommodate that supply in a way which still meets the needs of volunteering organisations. That's a real tough kind of trade-off to make. You don't want to kind of have to change what you're doing to suit the potential supply, but there might be some ways to better kind of match supply and demand.
So it might not be so much that people wake up and say, I want to volunteer and have no specific preference. They're more likely to have an idea of somewhere that might help the community or some activity they're more interested in.
Yep.
And they'll look if that is available first. And so
Exactly.
If it's not available to the level that those people want to get involved, there are opportunities to create those roles and kind of those
and also
up.
to say, perhaps I think what the data also suggests is that it's not so much a mismatch of the type of activity, it's more the industry. And I think it's kind of where there's a gap is people not necessarily knowing the breadth of industries which benefit from volunteers engaging, and I know that's a real tricky thing to navigate, but I think that the data kind of suggests that it's something which could have, thinking about it in that way could maybe help with easing the path for some.
We've got something that's come in from two different questions that will see us out of this Q&A, which is asking about people who have had more time become available. So Marie has asked whether older people volunteer more because of the stage of their life that they're in or because of the generation that they belong to. Perhaps there's some cultural identity among that generation. But we also had a question, and I'm just trying to find the name, which was, so Avril has asked if employment rate or unemployment rate has an impact on volunteering. And so different facets of when people have more time available to them due to not participating in the paid workforce, are they perhaps more likely to volunteer?
Yeah, so look, I think that's a really good question about kind of cohorts versus ages. And we did, in our survey, we don't have that long time series, but we do have some data on that from the census, which has been asking about volunteering rates back, I think, 4 or 5 censuses now, and you do see kind of a little bit of both, which is that for a given cohort, as you move through different censuses, a higher rate, but also those age patterns as well. So I think it's a combination of those things, and also I think what has been a real concern is that if that socialization in volunteering was broken by the pandemic, that it's harder to I mean, we know this in the data, that it's harder to start than it is to continue with an activity like volunteering. We certainly do find some relationship with paid work, although it's not quite as straightforward as more hours of paid work, less volunteering. So those who work part-time were no more or less likely to undertake volunteering than those who didn't work at all. And that kind of suggests to me there's kind of countervailing things. So one is that there's the amount of time available, which is clearly working part-time does cut into that. But then there's the networks and the links which you can get through your paid work, and those are kind of pulling in opposite directions. Certainly those who work full-time, so 35 hours or more in paid work, are more likely to, less likely to volunteer than those who those who don't work. But in terms of number of hours, we certainly find that there's a more consistent relationship between hours worked, hours in paid work, and hours in volunteer work. In that, even those who were working part-time were less likely had fewer hours than those who weren't working at all. So there's some different relationships, whether it's volunteering at all compared to not volunteering, and then hours volunteered compared to hours worked.
So even if we can identify an association between a cohort that someone might belong to,
Yep.
And a higher or lower rate of volunteering, it's not necessarily the direct cause and effect.
Sure,
There could be
exactly.
multiple
Yep.
things going on.
Yeah, and I think it's important to really look at some of those more proximate causes, whether it's through networks. As I said, the one of the in the presentation we kind of talked about kind of mental health as a barrier, and we know that mental health is a barrier to both paid and unpaid work, and that's so when you that's part of why there's that observed relationship between paid and unpaid work, because of this other factor which is influencing both.
Nick, I'm going to be greedy and ask one more, but
Sure.
It's talking about trends, and hopefully it's a more easy one to answer. But it's you mentioned the long-term decline in volunteering that was observable before, a sharp decrease due to
Yep.
COVID-19, and a rebound. The extent to which we've rebounded, have we reached the point that we would have been predicted to run into on the trend line in the long-term decline, or are we still a little short or a little above?
That's a deceptively simple question with a frighteningly complicated response. Look, I think the data suggests that there is still a lower rate of volunteering now than if pre-COVID trends had tracked through. So there is still, I think, people who either stopped or pulled back on their volunteering due to COVID, who otherwise would be volunteering. So I think you're right. It's part of a trend, but I think it's more than that as well.
Excellent. Well, we look forward to the next time we can tune into some ANU data and continue to observe these trends, and we can find out. But still plenty of room for volunteering to grow through our community. So thank you so much to Nick for the presentation today. So rich in information and so much to see in there. From the chat, we can see that people are really engaged in all the little nooks and crannies and details that we can look at today. And so thank you so much, Nick, for looking into that. So I'd now like to hand over to Sue from Volunteering Australia to discuss the broader context of research within Volunteering Australia.
Thank you, Zach, and thank you so much, Nick. That was a fantastic presentation as ever. And some great questions coming through on the chat and the Q&A still. We'll certainly be looking at those after the session today. Some great questions for possible future research as well, I think. And I wanted to just mention that some of the topics being raised in the Q&A were covered in papers which were part of the Volunteering Research Papers Initiative, which was part of the development of the National Strategy for Volunteering. We'll share the link with you, I think, in the chat and afterwards, and encourage you all to flick through those. But I also just wanted to briefly take the opportunity with having you all here to update you on Volunteering Australia's other research that's going on and highlight a few things that we will have coming up in the next few months. Informal volunteering was raised earlier, and I wanted to flag that we are continuing to work on that issue. Earlier this year, we published the findings from the STORY project, which was undertaken by Heba Aladawi, which aimed to better understand diverse understandings of volunteering and highlight how these activities might be taking place in the multicultural context. Our next output will be a wider landscape paper on informal volunteering, which will further explore the concept and practices of informal volunteering. And we'll also be releasing a new data fact sheet, which will bring together data on informal volunteering, which includes the work that Nick put out and his colleagues put out last year, but other sources of information on informal volunteering. Early next year, we'll be updating the key volunteering statistics document. For some of you, this is kind of a data Bible that we look after at Volunteering Australia, and that will be out in late January, we think, which will be updated with all the new data that has become available since it was last released in 2022. And I also just wanted to mention that in addition to our partnership with the ANU Centre for Social Research and Methods, we are industry partners on 2 projects which are currently funded under the Australian Research Council Linkage Programme. And this includes work on the Rural and Regional Australia Roadmap with Professors Kirsten Holmes, Leonie Lickstone-Binney and others. And then a further project which we're working with Professor Bing-Chin Lee and her colleagues at UNSW on community volunteerism and resilience to loneliness among culturally and linguistically diverse communities. So they're 2 projects which we're working with industry partners on, and you will hear more of over the next few months. Finally, I just wanted to say research is, of course, vital to the National Strategy for Volunteering, with Strategic Objective 3.3 explicitly referencing the need to invest in research, and we are obviously very supportive of that in Volunteering Australia. Data such as being released by Nick and his colleagues today will be invaluable in assessing the progress of the national strategy, and useful, of course, for the monitoring and evaluation framework, which is currently in development. And then I did just want to mention, and Zach, I promise this is the last thing, the National Volunteering Research Network, which meets quarterly to discuss volunteering research. If you're someone who undertakes research in an academic setting or elsewhere, and you would like to join this network, then please do get in touch. I think one of my colleagues will be putting the email link in, but it's research@volunteeringaustralia.org. So please get in touch and you can find out more about the National Volunteering Research Network. And Zach, I shall hand back to you.
Thank you very much, Sue. For anyone who is practicing research and volunteering, highly recommend the National Volunteering Research Network. Really engaging sessions and an excellent network of like-minded peers. So thank you so much for attending today, for giving us your time, for your enthusiasm, the detail in the questions. There were a lot of parallel conversations in the chat as well, people helping each other, as we can always see when we're discussing volunteering, people helping each other out, and sharing links, sharing resources. Especially thank you to Nick and everyone involved at ANU in investigating the data for today's session. So we'll be sending out the recording and also a link to the report when these are available following this session. It'll just take a little bit of time to put the editing together, but those will be available shortly and you'll receive that by email. They'll also be uploaded to our websites. In the meantime, we encourage you to stay abreast of everything that's happening in volunteering by following Volunteering Australia. I've put some links in the chat just now so you can subscribe to VA News, and also staying up to date with the National Strategy for Volunteering by subscribing to that newsletter. Also, you can see all the previous research that's come out through the National Strategy for Volunteering, including the volunteering research papers and the paper called The Volunteer Perspective, which came out previously in conjunction with this same ongoing ANU survey. So that's all from us today. Thank you so much for an engaging session. Thank you so much for your time. Really, really appreciate you tuning in today, and we hope to see you at the next one. Thank you.